I'm going to speak today about some work that was undertaken in conjunction with South East Sydney Local Health District Priority Populations Unit and the Ministry of Health that was looking at the use of translation apps. So the issue that sort of drove our interest in this area is really twofold. One is that the use of translation apps and websites in healthcare settings seems to be increasing. And the second is that machine translation might not be very accurate for a range of health information and a range of languages and settings. At the same time, we're seeing an explosion of interest in apps. You know, this is actually a print ad, thanks to Joanne, promoting the use of Google Translate as something that people can and should be using in times of crisis. And if we think about how that plays out in healthcare settings, we can see that there's going to be a lot of interest and also pressure to use translation apps. Before we get stuck in, I wanted to explain what we mean by machine translation and what some of the concepts underpinning this. So brace yourself, I'm not an expert in this, I'm not a data scientist, but I think it is worth clarifying what we mean by machine translation a little bit. And what's important to note is that really it's recurrent neural networks, and I'll explain what those are, that are driving a lot of these machine translation processes. These are neural networks that are used by almost all translation apps and websites, and it's really been a bit of a revolution in the last 3 years, and it's enabled enhancements in machine translation, but also these neural nets can run off your phone itself, has much lower processing demands and much lower server demands. So it means that it's more feasible to undertake a range of translation using machine learning processes. And sometimes when I talk to people, neural network, what does that mean? Does it mean it's a network of computers around the place? No, what it actually usually means is that it's a piece of software that functions as a predictive model. It's making predictions about which words go together, which phrases go together, and what is likely to match. And that in order to be set up, these recurrent neural networks actually need big training data sets. And what we mean by that is what the term they use is often a corpus, so a big body of data that's fed into these neural networks and helps to train it, and also is used to help check some of the accuracy of these predictions. So you might have done these kind of capture things. In the process, you've proved you're not a robot, but what you're actually doing in that process is training a robot. So this sort of training data is actually being used to form training data that's training neural networks how to recognise, in this case, storefronts. So this is the kind of data that's being used to actually train these neural networks. And in the case of translation, it's often things like written work, and you would have heard of Google Books project, which has been about scanning in a lot of the publications that have, a biggest amassed body of scanned in information. That's being used as a training database. So there's a few things that are interesting to note in terms of neural networks. This is a sort of simplified way of understanding what they are. So the in is this. That's some of the training data that's brought into the model. Neural networks are made up of sort of a few different components, but these are circles are representations of the neurons. So these are like, to use the analogy of neurons in our brain, these are the neurons in the neural network. There are also connections between these neurons that have different weightings. So not all neurons are created the same, and not all connections are the same. And this is dynamic, and they can change over time. There's also layers. So neurons from one layer feed sequentially into the next, and so on. And this relates to an output. So remember how we were saying it's about coming up with predictions? So what it does is it feeds in its training data, says, I think, to use our example of storefronts, I think this sort of lettering on the front of a building is indicative of a storefront, and so on. So it can use that information to build up a predictive model. What's different about recurrent neural networks, and where the recurrent part comes back, is that it checks this output and sees, is it optimal or not? So it's about optimizing that process, and it runs backwards and checks. So this is where the analogy of learning comes in, that it's generating a model, checking a model, running back and optimizing. So this is I know this is a bit wonkish, but it's actually quite important to understand what we're talking about. What's important to note is that neural networks typically have hundreds or thousands of neurons, Contrast that with the human brain that has about 100 billion neurons. But recurrent neural networks run a lot faster than neurons. They fire more often than human neurons can. And remember how I spoke about those layers of neurons? Those layers can change, the weightings can change and adapt, and this is where the learning aspect comes in. And that can be hard for us to understand and interpret, and it can change over time. So an example of, and they optimize for a defined output. So for example, the output in the example I showed is that we can reliably recognize storefronts. But this can also lead to some sort of unexpected impacts. So you might have seen some of these headlines about how can, racist algorithms. Now people aren't training these algorithms using race as a basis and so on. But if we think back to our example, what's happened is that they might have been fed information about socioeconomic status, where people live, language spoken at home and other things. And the neural network itself might derive and develop a model that actually comes up with something that's like race. And so we end up with potentially racist algorithms. There's a famous example that many of you would have heard of an algorithm that's been used to come up with parole recommendations in America, and that ended up, because it was including factors like do they have any relatives or friends who are in jail and so on, where do they live and so on, ended up making much higher rates of recommending that there not be parole granted amongst African American populations than other populations. So we can see that not understanding the guts of neural networks is actually quite significant and can have big consequences, meaningful consequences in the real world. So what does this mean for us in healthcare? Like, that's a bit of a potted history of neural networks, but this is how it can play out in our settings. Here's an example of some information about how to prepare for a colonoscopy in English that's been translated using a popular translation app into Nepali, and then I've translated it back again, so we might have some compounding of the errors, but you get a sense, if we look at this is the initial instructions, what we get back is before your colonoscopy, you need to drink some fluid that will open your eyes and remove it from the stools so that we can see the face of your hair. At one level you think the words sort of make sense, but it's sort of totally stripped of meaning. But believe it or not, this is actually a lot better. When I ran it the other day, this is what it looked like a year ago. So remember what we're saying about these neural networks are learning. They're getting new input data. They're also learning and optimizing that translation. This is what it looked like a year ago, which is even more difficult to understand. I'm not sure what a collopoia pause is and so on. And remove from stool so that we can see your face. But we can imagine that this is a real scenario that people are confronted with if they're given written information about how to prepare for a colonoscopy in advance, and they're using a translation app to translate. So this is what it means in practice. We found that there's a potential range of uses that can happen or are happening already. So that's during one-on-one clinical interactions. It's also about the translation of written information, general health information, and also a number of websites we've found are actually being translated into other languages using machine translation processes. But it's really important to note that we're a bit unclear about who's initiating use and in what circumstances. Is it the healthcare provider? Is it the person or the consumer or their family members? And so that's what drove a lot of our interest in this. The context, Tony's touched on a lot of this already. Most of the research in this area is focused on the accuracy of these recurrent neural networks. How good is the translation, essentially. There's been some work done looking at the types of apps that already exist and are out there. There's been less on what is the actual nature of use. How is this rolling out and playing out in real health services? In 2017, there was a survey done that focused primarily on that was done by Multicultural Health in Southeast Sydney, focused primarily on what are the issues around access to interpreters and use of interpreters. There was a question included, almost as a sort of second thought, about translation apps. And this survey found that 18% of respondents had used translation apps. That partially informed the update to the policy directive in December 2017 that Tony alluded to, that says that it's really not acceptable to use machine translation for clinical information and in healthcare contexts. So that's where we sort of got started with this work. So we thought, okay, what we really need to get a handle on is what is the nature and extent of the translation app use in state-funded healthcare services in New South Wales. So we did two things. We did a staff survey that many of you may have encountered when it was emailed around, and semi-structured qualitative interviews with people who agreed to be interviewed. So who participated? We got 1,500 respondents from across 5 LHDs, local health districts. We had a low response rate overall of around 2%, but it's worth noting that we had good representation across a range of clinical areas. But I think that 2% response rate is worth noting. 80% were female and 18% male, and 70% were clinical staff who participated in the survey. In terms of the qualitative interviews, we had 24 interview participants, again from 5 local health districts, and they encompassed a range of professional groups, but also managers and senior managers and people who had policy-related roles. So what we found from the survey was 33% of people reported they had used a translation app or website in a clinical encounter. So that's a third. Of that third, 3/4 had used a translation app within the past year, and around 57% in the last 3 months. What was really interesting to me, and something I guess I hadn't necessarily anticipated, was that it's clinicians who reported initiating use in 2/3 of cases. And that 73% had most recently, so we asked people to reflect on their most recent use of translation apps, had used it between 8:30 and 5 p.m. And that's significant if we think about business hours and when it might be easier to get access to interpreters and interpreter services. And 40% had used an app after a request for a professional interpreter had been made. So that's potentially meaningful, but it also means that almost 60% didn't request an interpreter before using the app. Who tended to be the users? We found that they were significantly more likely to be younger. So use amongst people aged under 40 was around 40%, versus only 28% for people aged over 40. They tended to be male, which is potentially meaningful as well, considering that 80% of our sample was female. They tended to be less experienced. So use was higher amongst people who'd worked for New South Wales Health for less than 10 years compared to people who'd worked for New South Wales Health for more than 10 years. And they tended to be clinical staff. So around 41% of clinical staff had used translation apps compared to 16% of non-clinical staff. Keeping in mind that non-clinical staff can include people who've got patient and client contact as well. So for example, admin and ward staff and so on. In terms of professional groups, who's using it, use was highest amongst medical workforce, followed by nursing and midwifery, with lower rates of use amongst allied health and admin roles. In terms of where people reported using translation apps, use was highest amongst people working in emergency departments and inpatient settings, and comparatively less use in outpatient and community and admin settings. Of including imaging and radiology there, we actually only had around 20 respondents in that category, but I think it's worth including and noting, because and to me that seemed like an unexpectedly high rate of use. In terms of perceptions of app use, 93% rated translation apps as useful or very useful. So they're seen as useful by respondents. 57% said that there was a risk, the risk of misinterpretation was low or none. So there's still a significant proportion of people, majority of people, who think there is a low risk of misinterpreting. But only around a third rated the translation as accurate or very accurate. So there's some sort of interesting interplays there, I think. One of the things that came out of our analysis of the qualitative interviews, and there's a lot in the qual data actually, but I wanted to just highlight that people spoke a lot about weighing up, a sort of a risk appraisal or a weighing up that goes on in terms of, on the one hand, the inaccuracy of translations versus time. And this was a recurrent issue that came up. So here's a quote that sort of partially gets at that. When the patient expressed themselves in a way that I felt I almost certainly understood, it was congruent with what his hand gestures and his behaviour was, I thought, understood the response. But it was a very simple communication. I think anything that was about symptoms would be difficult to rely on a translation app. Here's another example that alludes to the same thing. I won't read out all of them, but you know, this example speaks to some of the practicalities that people encounter in clinical settings. You know, they said that this person was in a bed and they weren't necessarily they weren't confident they could get a face-to-face Thai interpreter, but they were conscious the person was in bed and it might not be feasible to get the phone interpreter to the bedside. And so there was a chance, and so they made an appraisal that there was some basic questions being asked, so we thought it would be okay. Another example, people explicitly acknowledging time constraints. And to skip to the end, you know, we can't provide them with an interpreter every single time. Basically, I think it's down to the best thing they can do. So there is maybe not always a highly conscious, but there is a kind of weighing up of risks that's going on. But people recognise the limitations and constraints of this. So this quote, I think, highlights that well. Different cultures explain things differently. There's no direct translation. You have to understand a language. You can't just use a word. So I think this is an important issue that interpreters routinely encounter, that you know, in some languages there's not a direct translation, particularly for medical terminology. So interpreters amongst themselves are developing and sharing some of that terminology as well. So you can't type in a word and expect it guaranteed accurate. And here's another one that sort of sums up some of the considerations that people are making. If it's emotive or it involves more risk, I think it's imperative that you have accurate interpreting. I don't think non-human ways of doing it are good enough at the present. So you can see, I quite like those quotes because you can actually see that they reflect some of the conversations you might have had, you know, the attitudes and experiences that people have in the system. So what does all this mean? I guess in answer to our original question, use appears to be moderately widespread in state-funded health services in New South Wales. In most cases, it's clinicians who are initiating use. And I put some caveats around this. Use might be growing. So remember the 2017 survey I mentioned? They had 18% who reported app use. If we limit this survey to just a similar geographical area, the similar local health districts, 30 of the 300 from that who answered the survey from that similar area, 38% reported app use. So we have to put caveats around it. Different survey, different sample, but use may be increasing and quite rapidly. And there's a contradiction, I think, inherent into a lot of what we found from both the survey but also the qual data, that app translation on one hand is seen as not being accurate, but that the potential consequences of this are seen as low. So people are sort of doing a bit of a weighing up or making trade-offs. People are potentially, it might not be even conscious, but they are making a bit of a risk appraisal, and that might be done on the run quite often. So a significant limitation that I want to emphasise, though, is that we did have a low response rate overall, so we can't make any broad claims about representativeness of the system as a whole. However, we did have a lot of people participated in quite good representation from different clinical groups and clinical settings. I think the other thing to note is that there might be potential for self-censorship, recognising that the policy directive proscribes use. The actual rates of use could be higher than what we found. What remains unknown is, I think, we've got a bit of a sense of how this is playing out in local health districts in New South Wales. Is there variability in how it's rolling out in other settings? So, for example, is this occurring in general practice? Is it occurring in residential aged care? Is it occurring in, NDIS-funded services? Is it, playing out differently in other human and social service settings? there's some suggestion, there's some reasons to think that it may be, but there's also some suggestion that it might be, it might not be. So for example, often people who don't speak English, that don't have a high degree of English, report that they go and seek out primary care providers, GPs, who are able to do consults in the same language and so on. So it might be playing out similarly or quite differently in other settings. I think also really importantly is we have to understand what's the actual perspective, not of health services and professionals, but actually consumers, family members and carers in this. How do they perceive this? And what are the problems and issues from their perspective that they foresee with the use of machine translation? And also, because this lies at the intersection of a few different fields, I'm conscious I've come at this from a bit of a health services research lens, but there's also a broad range of interest in this from communication and linguistics, psychology, and even data science that's driving a lot of this. And we tend to be approaching, studying and understanding this in reasonably siloed disciplinary ways, and maybe we need a more integrated research approach. Primarily though, I'm struck by the sense of it's difficult to develop feasible and realistic policy responses and guidance on this because we do know the limitations of it, but we also have to acknowledge use is happening. A significant issue that Tony touched on is privacy and data governance. Skype, that many of you will have used, has actually got maybe a less well-known feature, but it does real-time translation in 10 languages, and I've tried it. It's not bad. You know, it's not good, but it's not bad. But what's interesting is just in the last month, there's been a minor scandal about this, that it's not just being sent off to Microsoft servers to then be sent back as translated audio. There are people listening into these conversations. Keeping in mind what we were talking about earlier about our training data and our checks on outputs, that's actually being performed by humans. Humans are listening to conversations to see, I don't think the translation really got it right there, and so on. So this is just in the last month. Keep in mind, next time you get the push from colleagues to start using Skype for Business as well. So this is something that's quite real and quite contextually relevant as well. It's worth also thinking about where are we up to in this? I find it a bit hard to know. Are we at the precipice of something happening, or are we already there with machine translation? You know, is this something we're going to live with, or is it ramping up, or is it going to go away? This model is called, you know, the Gartner's hype cycle, which is sort of a funny approach. I've got some issues with it because it sort of alludes not just to the adoption of technology, but also the marketing and spin around technology as well. There's also reservations because not all technology is adopted in a way that's reflected in this approach. But you see, you know, we have the peak of inflated expectations and then the trough of disillusionment when the technology doesn't live up to the hype, and then the plateau of productivity. And I think in some ways we can see some evidence that we might be in a bit of an inflated expectations period about what machine translation can do. But then again, if we look down the end and think the plateau of productivity adoption is 20 to 30% of the potential audience, well, we might be there. Another perhaps more sensible way of thinking about this is normalization process theory, which is a theory that's been developed based on whether innovations or new techniques or approaches get adopted into clinical settings. So it's actually grown out of health services research. It emphasises that there's sort of 4 elements to keep in mind, and they're not exactly sequential, but they need to be thought of as important in understanding whether new practices get adopted or not. Coherence is about, does this make sense as a thing? Is it a sufficiently distinct enough practice that it makes sense and we can name it and describe it? And I think we're there with machine translation. Cognitive participation is there buy-in? Are people thinking this is something we should be doing? And I think we can see that for at least a portion of people, there is cognitive participation. Collective action is more about, is there evidence of the organisational and workforce support and practices and processes to embed it? And reflexive monitoring is where we try and understand it more deeply and might have monitoring or quality improvement processes in place. So I don't know that we're there for collective action and reflexive monitoring, but there's some sense that we might be quite far down the track of adoption. What's different in this case is that unlike other innovations, which are perhaps a bit more planned and staged, this is something that's come from the outside. This is sort of an externality that's intruded upon the way we do translation and interpreting. One of the things to keep in mind, I think, is also, deep learning. And, you would have come across people saying we need to get AI embedded in everything. We need to feed in all the health systems data into artificial intelligence, and that'll tell us where to focus our efforts. But I think there's a risk that by using terminology like learning and so on, we're falling into the trap of poor metaphors. And this is actually from a book that was just published 2 weeks ago that I really enjoyed reading and would recommend to you all. It's by 2 cognitive psychologists talking about the problems with AI. And their central argument is, if artificial intelligence is so smart, why can't it read? Think about the implications of that for interpreting translation. This quote I quite like because it emphasises, it can't incorporate background knowledge easily in recurrent neural networks. So a system can learn to predict, remember we're talking about predictive models, that the words wallet and safe space can occur in similar kinds of sentences. So he put his money in the wallet, he put his money in a safe space, but it has no way to relate that to the fact that people like to protect their possessions. And so I think that's the problem, is that we need to be thinking about the metaphors we're using when we're talking about use and application of machine learning or neural networks in our work more generally. The future? Well, I think the point I've ended up with this work is that humans still matter in this process. Thomas Svoboda wrote this 2 years ago. He called for this idea of superlinguists that will be, in some sense, refining the inputs and refining the outputs, but also recognising that there's a whole bunch of stuff that machine learning will never adequately do. However, I think what's really important is to note, and I agree with what he said here, technology is not set to become autonomous in the medium term. It can serve people very well if applied with boldness and creativity, as well as responsibility. So I think that's the imperative, but also the challenge for us, is to engage with this. It's happening. How do we engage with it in a way that maximises the potential benefits? And I think some of this is also the challenge for what we're doing, is moving beyond a transmission model of communication that emphasises I'm a transmitter, you're a recipient. And I've deliberately used a lecture hall sort of image for that, and I'm conscious of the irony of talking about this while I'm lecturing at you. However, we need to recognise that even if we have a perfect translation of the words, there's other factors that influence communication. Communication is dynamic, and this is only part of the picture. We need to recognise that factors like health literacy, the extent to which we can understand what the factors that can inform and guide our own health and decisions that affect our own health is really significant, and the role that we can play in that. I think community and culture needs to be understood not just as a technical barrier to sort of translation of words. It is the medium through which we frame identity and meaning. It is very central to human experience, And so I think we can never take that out of the equation by thinking we can just chuck an algorithm in the middle of that. And also thinking about what would genuine person-centred approaches look like. A lot of the challenges that people alluded to in the qualitative work were service and professional challenges. But what would a real response that came to the guts of what people are worried about experiencing as people engaged in health and enhancing their health, what would that look like? And finally, I just wanted to emphasise what's at stake. On the one hand, there is, I think, patient safety, clinical safety is a significant thing that we need to be concerned about. However, even if those sort of severe potential adverse events as a result of bad machine translation are something that we have to be mindful of, there's also a bigger and broader risk that for a much bigger number of cases will be ineffectual. We won't be actually making the change to people's health that we could and should be making. I think also there's a fundamental issue of sort of human dignity. The need to be understood, to communicate, to be heard, and to be respected is about as fundamental a human need as we have. And there's a real risk that if we embrace that, we undermine that function of what we do. I'd like to acknowledge the funders, as I mentioned, and also our fantastic site investigators and our collaborators, who really this wouldn't have been possible without it all. So I'd like to really thank them, many of whom are in the room. Also, if you're interested, these slides are available at that URL. Thanks very much for your time.